On this episode of the WildFed podcast.
Of the fish in the ocean that we know about, 90% of them are harvested. People need to eat, but I'm not sure that meat protein is the best answer.
Globally, as a species, we're 8 billion now. A huge amount of our food is coming out of the oceans. It's essentially really like the last major wild food.
People are really chomping at the bit to start mining on the seabed, and we don't even know what lives there.
We started eating mastodons, let's say, and we start working our way down to now we're picking apart the algae and the plankton. Like we're running out of things to eat.
We're just a species. And what is the role of a species? To persist. And we're just incredibly good at it.
You can destroy this habitat, but you can carbon offset it somewhere else. I feel like that's a huge mistake in thinking.
Be curious, be skeptical, seek logical answers. That's what's going to get us out of all of this.
Episode 163 of the WildFed podcast, Can We Save the Seas with Dr. Ann Cleveland, is brought to you by Surthrival. Man, I'm excited to introduce a new product at surthrival.com. We've teamed up with Hammond's Black Walnuts, and after a year of behind-the-scenes work, I'm proud to finally introduce Surthrival's Black Walnut Protein Powder. This is the most exciting new product I've seen in my 15 years in the health food and nutritional supplement industry. I've been using it for over 6 months every morning in my smoothie and loving it more each day. It fortifies my blended drinks with 17 grams of wild protein per scoop. But the story is even more incredible because the black walnuts in our protein powder are hand foraged from wild native trees. There's no fertilizer, no irrigation, no pesticides used anywhere in the process. No agricultural land is used either, so no habitat is disrupted to produce these nuts. All the foragers are volunteers paid by the pound for their harvests. In other words, when you invest in Surthrival's Black Walnut Protein Powder, it's not just an investment in your health. You're investing in wild lands, wild species, healthy ecosystems, and the people who tend to them. I can honestly say it's hands down the most ethically sourced and produced protein product ever made. It's also the cleanest because we use the same ultra-pure CO2 extraction process used in high-end cannabis extracts. This yields a light-colored raw protein powder far superior to the ones made with higher heat expeller pressing. It's a very fine flour too, so we've used it in more than just smoothies. My wife's been baking it into cookies and muffins, turning them into wild protein fortified snacks, and she uses it in her oatmeal at breakfast too. I'm excited to see all the recipes you come up with using this really versatile ingredient. Wild North American native trees, 100% grown and processed in the USA. Sometimes it feels too good to be true. We've managed to bring a wild, hand-foraged, native North American food to people in a format they can easily use to fortify their diets daily. Head over to surthrival.com to check out the entire product line and use the coupon code WildFed to get an additional 5% off your order. Surthrival's Black Walnut Protein Powder, the first wild protein powder on the market ever. Do you need an antidote to the metaverse? We just launched our newest t-shirt design over at wild-fed.com. It features our antidote to the metaverse tagline on the chest, a WildFed badge on the sleeve, and 2 tarot-style cards juxtaposed on the back, one modeled on the tarot card known as the Fool, who's wearing an Oculus and absent-mindedly walking off the roof of a building with a bag of fast food in one hand and a cell phone in the other. Next to it is a card based on the Magician, who's juggling 4 implements, a fishing rod, a rifle, a trap, and a foraging basket. It represents our belief that a life that includes the outdoors inoculates you against believing that an artificial experience of life could ever replace a natural one. You see, for us, being WildFed, hunting, fishing, and foraging is about a lot more than just getting our groceries. It's an antidote to the metaverse, an act of rebellion against the transhuman agenda that is leading humanity to abandon the natural world in favor of wearing screens over their eyes to live in a virtual one. We choose the natural over the artificial. We choose an antidote to the metaverse. We choose to be fed by the wild. Check out our new shirt at wild-fed.com. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. I met Dr. Ann Cleveland back on Halloween of this year when I was invited to give a guest lecture at the Maine Maritime Academy, where she's a marine biology professor. Her husband, Dr. Alan Verde, who's also a professor there, was a guest on our show back on episode 160. While we were there, Ann gave my wife and I a tour of the campus, and we had the opportunity to talk a bit about her work there, and I thought it'd be great to get her on the show to discuss it. I didn't expect to take such a deep detour into the big picture of our precarious situation here on Earth, but I'm glad I did. She and I go deep on topics of climate, fisheries, and our future here on this beautiful planet. I always imagine that those in marine biology must have a front row seat from which to view the severity of our pollution crisis, habitat and biodiversity loss, and the rapid climate-induced ecological changes that are taking place in a way that most of us, especially if we aren't engaged ecologically with nature, are only intellectually aware of at best or oblivious to at worst. So in this conversation, I quickly found myself parting with ichthyology, the study of fish, and focusing more on the existential. It's hard not to, since the more time I spend hunting, fishing, and foraging, the more concerned I grow for the planet's ecology. Not because of hunting, fishing, or foraging themselves, but because, like I just mentioned from marine biologists, these food pursuits bring you face to face with the reality of what's happening in the environment that everyone loves talking about, but so few people really go out and experience. In particular, I wrestle with the population-wide reliance on commercial fisheries, and I always cringe to say that out loud. I have a lot of friends that make their living as fishermen. I love what they do. I love to eat what they harvest, and I love to go out fishing with them whenever I have the opportunity. I deeply respect the trade, profession, and ancient lifestyle of those who work the sea. I recognize its important place in our heritage and that it's a lot more than just a job. I also feel that ending the market hunt was one of the best things we could have done for conservation, and it's the reason that contemporary folks like you or me get to hunt in North America. If we'd continued on harvesting our game for the market, it's unlikely there'd be much of anything to hunt today. Many now recovered extirpations would have no doubt become extinctions. I'd be remiss not to mention the passenger pigeon as a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Things in our seas are more complex. First, they're far more productive than our terrestrial ecosystems, giving the false impression that they can supply our population with protein limitlessly. Due to the water's obfuscation, the ocean's reserves can seem bottomless, but of course they aren't. With so much of the modern world still dependent on the sea for its food, I don't think it's alarmist to be concerned about the sustainability of this approach. But unlike land masses with sovereign borders, the seas are a shared resource. Who can regulate them? Who would we trust to regulate them? And while we here in the U.S. have made tremendous strides towards sustainable regulation, much of the world is far too concerned with immediate subsistence to trifle with such concerns. People need to eat. I believe in wild foods. Of course, it's why I make this show. In particular, I think the wild foods of the sea are critical to our health and can help foster an important relationship to planetary ecology when approached with that intention. But like a good old case of cognitive dissonance, I simultaneously fear we are taking too much, too fast, with technologies that are too disruptive or too effective. Want to know the solution? Yeah, me too. But until then, I appreciate being able to have the conversation. So big thanks to Dr. Ann Cleveland, who came on to talk about ichthyology and found herself in a conversation about the sustainability of the human lifeway on the planet Earth. And I really appreciate your input and perspectives here. I hope this conversation inspires some deeper thought and inquiry into the topic. It certainly is becoming a pressing one, and I can't help but think things are just getting started. Dr. Ann Cleveland, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you. And I just want to say thank you for the tour you gave me of the campus over at Maine Maritime Academy a couple weeks ago. That was really nice when I got done giving my talk there, you sort of brought me around and I really appreciated that.
You know, it's a lot of fun to show people the campus because we are like the big secret in Maine, right? And so anytime that we can show people what we have and that waterfront is, yeah,
I mean,
great.
The ships down there blew my mind, actually.
Yeah.
What a resource to have for a school.
No kidding. And just fun stuff, right? We do this thing called supplemental seamanship. And I used to go, it's on Monday afternoons at 4, and you could go out and you can learn to drive whatever boat you want to learn to drive.
Really?
So that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. You know, Grant and I, Grant's my producer for the podcast, but also cinematographer for our TV show.
Uh-huh.
And we were just talking about this yesterday. I bought a 20-foot boat a couple years ago, and the learning curve, it's my first boat, and I didn't
Yep.
have any experience. I'd been on boats, but I'd never really piloted a boat. And man, the learning curve is steep. And it's not just in the water, it's the trailering and
Oh yeah.
putting the boat in and out and all that is the most challenging. So,
Yeah.
I bought a brand new boat, and of course, the first time I put it in, I'm smashing it all up. And so it's been a learning curve. But it's like the kind of thing I wish I had some kind of more formal exposure to, rather than having to like adult learn it.
It's funny. I grew up in Ipswich, Massachusetts, which is just
Oh
north
yeah,
of
I know where
Boston,
that
and
is.
we
Yep.
were right on the ocean. And all these people would buy these brand new boats, city folks, and they would come down and they'd launch their boats in front of our house. So growing up, I got to see some people learn how to drive a boat at an early age. So I know exactly what you're talking about, and I can get a boat from here to there. Um, Pretty easily. It's if you don't know the boat when you're first trying to bring it in to like the dock or something like that, and if it's windy and the currents are going one way and all that, yeah, it's tough.
Yeah, the weekend warriors at the boat ramp. That's the hardest
Mhm.
part. And I had a friend give me really sound advice, which was like, do not let anyone rush you at the boat ramp.
Right.
Just act like they're not there. Take as long as you need to take, because this was coming from a guy who dropped his boat off the trailer onto the beach
Ooh,
accidentally.
ooh,
He's
yeah,
like missed the ocean. Um,
yeah.
hey, so I was just reading in your bio something fascinating. I want to talk a little bit about what your education's in and your degrees are in, but you say in your bio you've been a marine biologist since you were 18 months old. I thought that was so cool to frame it that way. So tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, your career, your background, and your interest in the ocean.
Yeah, okay. So, like I said, I grew up right on the water, right? My house was as close to the water as my office is here to the water, and my parents both liked the water. My dad was an avid fisherman and sailor, and so
What did he fish
and
for?
Oh, well, he was an electrical engineer, so fishing was a hobby. So when in my neighborhood, it was like striped bass and
Hmm.
mackerel and flounder
Hmm.
were most of the things that we caught. But he was also really big into fly fishing. But I didn't join him on those things. That was for my brothers to do with it when they went camping. But so grew up there and played in the water from as early as I could remember. There's pictures of me splashing around in the water before I even have a memory. And then we would come up here to Maine because this is where my mom's family's from. And there were all these trout and salmon hatcheries up here. And my father would take us to go to the salmon and trout hatcheries. And I just remember watching the fish swimming in those raceways and just mesmerized. And I mean, what, I was 4 or 5 years old. And I said, oh, that's it. That's it. Fish. It's all about the fish,
Really,
whatever it
huh?
is. You know how kids get into the
Yeah.
dinosaur thing?
Uh-huh.
I was pre-dinosaur craze, so I got into the fish.
That's
And
so
then
cool.
so I knew probably in high school that I wanted a PhD. At that point, I thought it was in oceanography because I didn't know the difference between oceanography and marine biology.
Tell
Um,
folks what the difference is.
well, yeah, there's the long answer and the short answer. The short answer that I give parents when they come with their kids to visit campus, marine biologists can kind of see the bottom, and oceanographers can't. So,
Mm.
marine biologists are often working on scuba or snorkel or maybe in the intertidal zone, whereas oceanographers are kind of out deep water, requires vessels and a lot more remote sensing of their environment. So, and I didn't wanna do that. I love going to sea, but I didn't wanna be tied to a computer. I'd
Can I ask
rather
a
be
question real quick?
diving. Yeah.
What kind of data are oceanographers looking at versus? I mean, when I hear marine biology, I think, okay, you're studying life forms of the sea.
Yeah.
And are oceanographers more like geographers of the sea?
Oh, yeah, some of them are. So there's 4 disciplines in oceanography. Biology is one of them, although biological oceanography is looking more about, um, productivity in the ocean. So where's the photosynthesis happening? Where's the bottom of that food web, occurring, and what influences
Oh,
whether there's a lot of productivity or there's very little
so like looking
productivity?
at trophic cascades and such.
Absolutely, absolutely. And looking at, well, We know that phytoplankton is really good about taking up CO2. So let's fertilize the water so we get a big phytoplankton bloom, and it'll
Oh
take up
yeah.
CO2, and then they'll all sink to the bottom. I mean,
Okay, so that's
that's
like a
kind of a
big
hot topic right
100,000
now.
foot view that you take
Yeah,
of the biological systems in the
exactly.
ocean versus studying specific organisms at a more microscopic level.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then like physical oceanographers, they study things like currents. Where do the currents go? Why do they go where they go? What are surface currents? What are deep water currents? What's the thermohaline circulation? How does the Gulf Stream meander?
Yeah.
Geological oceanographers are definitely the ones who are looking at, how did the seafloor form and what's on the seafloor. And then chemical oceanographers look at things like, you can trace water parcels, knowing where they're formed and where they move by looking at their chemical components. But also, they're the ones that are studying ocean acidification, right? And pollutants in the ocean and things like that. So it's and the types of data that they collect are, these large scale, huge data sets that then you have to kind of parse out and figure out what do they mean. So it's really is a matter of scale. Marine biology is looking kind of on a smaller scale in time and in space than oceanographers are.
Are marine biologists more? It's more like it's a marine zoology kind of. Is that fair to say? Like,
Uh, no, because some marine biologists are very, very much interested in phycology or
oh,
the
okay,
marine
right,
algae.
sure. Hmm.
So they might. One of my very good friends from, oh gosh, 40 years now. He studies the physiology of the big seaweeds
Okay,
in the
yeah,
Pacific Northwest. So, and he's also, I would say, a marine ecologist.
yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So you said initially you thought you were going to be an oceanographer, but you realized that, or I'll just let you pick it up from there. You thought
Yeah.
oceanography initially,
Yeah, because I didn't know the difference, right?
right?
I just knew fish swam in the ocean. So
Sure.
I figured, "Oh,
Oh,
I guess I need to
oceanography.
be an oceanographer."
Yeah.
And then when I went to college, I majored in zoology, which I went to the University of New Hampshire, which was the only school I wanted to go to, and so I was really, fortunate that I was accepted there. Um, and I majored in zoology, which obviously is not just marine, but when you go to school at a college that's so close to the coast, so a half an hour from the shore or whatever, a lot of the stuff that we did on field trips and we looked at in lab was from the marine environment. So that was good. Although I didn't take a single course in ichthyology when I was there
Hmm.
because they didn't teach that.
Right.
So I really was just getting the background, but I knew that I
For
wanted to go
listeners, the
on.
study of fish, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Ichthyology.
ichthyology is the study of fish, yeah. I knew that I wanted to go on to graduate school. But I took a year off after I finished my bachelor's degree, and I worked at, various, entry-level jobs for a year, went back to graduate school, and a program in marine science. So, and this is where I realized, oh, oceanography is not really my thing, because it was the Institute of Marine Sciences at the University of North Carolina, and you took courses in chemical, physical, biological, and geological oceanography. And that's where I said, oh, this is different from what I thought it was. I loved all of it in that I teach that now. And
Hmm.
so it really kind of informed my teaching, but it wasn't what I wanted to study. So I transferred to the University of Rhode Island and got my master's degree there, where I studied these little sticklebacks. They're fish that live in the estuary. They're actually really, really fun fish. So that got me back to the fish, but it wasn't tropics. And at this point, I'm like, no, I just want to do coral reefs. So I finished that degree. I worked for 7 years out in the industry before I went back for my PhD. So at that point, I knew I totally wanted to study tropical coral reef fish. So I knew at that point how to find people that were studying that. I learned how to write grants to fund that. So for my PhD, I worked in Panama, on the Atlantic coast of Panama, working on damselfishes. And then from there, I went to Japan and I did a postdoc there. That was more in aquaculture. But while I was there, I went and visited the Philippines, which I'd been to before. and realized that there's a lot of really interesting fish on those coral reefs. And my husband also studies coral reefs. He looks at it from the invertebrate side. I looked at it from the vertebrate side. So that just worked into a good research direction. So that's kind of how I got here. I spent 2 years as an observer on the fishing vessels up in the Bering Sea, Gulf of Alaska. So pretty much it's been fish all of my adult life.
Yeah. What were they fishing on those fishing vessels?
I was on a couple different ones, depending, because you do like 3 months on, 3 months off. The first boat I was on was mainly focused on black cod, which is not a cod,
Right.
but
Black
it
hyphen cod.
yeah, exactly. So that's mostly what they were targeting on that vessel. My next vessel was looking at black cod and rockfish. I worked on another one that was targeting Pacific cod.
When they say
Uh,
rockfish there, they are like related to our Acadian redfish.
yes,
Okay,
exactly.
because like here, rockfish is
I
striped
know.
bass, so it gets so confusing.
It gets so confusing, and like students they'll say, "What kind of fish is this?" And I say, "Well, I know what I'd call it. I don't know what you'd call it."
Yeah, when people are like, "Why all the Latin names?" It's like, well, travel around a little bit.
Yeah,
Start
it
saying
really
say
it
rockfish
really
in a few
helps.
places.
Yeah, everyone needs to have the same name. What else did they fish for? Pollock. I did a
Hmm.
couple pollock runs. But yeah, that's mostly what we were targeting. And I mostly worked on the longliners. I did a few trawlers, but I liked the longliners better.
Uh-huh.
The boats were smaller. I knew the crew better. The bycatch was not as awful
That's got to be a
or as
hard part of it,
expensive.
just like seeing that bycatch,
Yeah.
or just a method, because there are some methods that you're like, I don't know how I feel about this ethically,
Yeah.
or the
Yeah.
sustainability of it.
Yeah, exactly. I only worked on 2 trawlers, and fortunately, they were midwater trawlers, and so they weren't tearing up the bottom, but they would catch, particularly the big one. I mean, we'd catch sharks and things, and it's like, oh, and,
Yeah,
they're dead when they come on board, and
right.
it's awful.
I want to go back to something when you were talking about the different disciplines in oceanography.
Mhm.
I had noted that there's this concept I'm sure you're quite familiar with. I don't know how you feel about it as a scientist, but there's been this idea put forward that this era could be called the Anthropocene.
Yep.
And I know some people dispute that idea, but I think everybody understands it, kind of at a intellectual level, that this is an epoch that is defined by human changes to the landscape, human induced changes to the landscape. And it sounded like so much of the field of oceanography, as you were describing the different ones, it's like, I'm curious to what degree the study of human impact on the ocean is dominating the field now. And also in marine biology, because it seems like at this point it's kind of like the elephant in the room or something. It's just like, how could you not be looking at that with the amount of changes that we've induced, and the impacts that we're having? Is that becoming like a significant, and especially over your career, has that become a significant part? Was it not before? I don't know if you can pick apart that question. It's sort of ill-formed, but
No, no, absolutely. I have definitely seen the focus of a lot of people's research change, or even if, like, when I first started for my PhD, I was looking at the physiology and ecology of these 2 damselfish species that would compete with each other, and that was a very basic biology ecology question,
you
and
could have
I
been looking
didn't.
at that 10,000 years ago,
Yeah,
and you could
exactly.
look at it today, right? Like this is just this ancient relationship. It has nothing to do with, CO2 or temperature changes,
Absolutely.
right?
Yep,
Mhm.
absolutely. And so that was the focus of my research, because I mean, I think we knew about things were coming, but at my level, people weren't really talking about it. They were still talking about global warming, and I hate that word because there are places that are going to get cold. So
Yeah.
I use the climate change. I use the
Yeah.
climate change terminology. But so, that was early 90s, right? Um, Now when I think about my own work, now I work the most recently, the fishes that I work with are anemone fishes in the Philippines. And so I think the biggest thing that they're experiencing on the reefs is, first of all, overexploitation, and everybody wants to collect an anemone fish or clownfish and put it in their aquarium. But the water's warming up, and that impacts the anemones that they live in, and ocean acidification impacts how all of them, how they develop and how they find their reefs. So we notice that we've seen changes. There's also a big part of pollution there, and so we look at all of that. Even our basic biology now is, we have a lens of how is the current environment changing this. So I would say in biology, marine biology, scientists are paying attention to that. In oceanography, I think a lot of the questions, because it is a bigger picture, a lot of those questions are very current and associated with climate change. There are still people out there that are looking at, oh, how does the Gulf Stream meander? And that's what they're interested in. Or I really want to map this seafloor because I want to know what it looks like.
Mm-hmm.
But we know that as the oceans warm and the ice caps start to melt, that changes the salinity in the water, it changes the temperature in the water, that changes the circulation. So the major currents are going to change, both surface and even the deep water currents are going to change.
Yeah.
And then, people are concerned about ocean acidification and how atmospheric CO2 is changing the pH of the ocean. How do we geoengineer that? And of course, the I don't want to say bad side, but everyone's looking to the ocean for more resources. Underwater mining, people are really chomping at the bit to start mining on the seabed, and we don't even know what lives there. And
Right.
we don't know what the impacts are. And you could say, oh, well, there'll be pollutants from drilling and we can mitigate that. But sound pollution, nobody knows how noisy these things are going to be. And sound travels really far and fast in the ocean. So
I've been seeing a lot of articles about the impact of particularly military sonar on whales and dolphins and such. So, these are things that unintended consequences, I guess. Yeah. I sometimes worry about, maybe correct if this feels like a logical error on my part, please jump in and correct it. I one of the things that's challenged me with the term climate change is I think that it sometimes, because I completely get what you're saying with global warming, that's almost deceptive in a sense. And I remember in the 70s, it seemed like the fear was global cooling. And then it became global warming. And then it's like, hey, let's settle on climate change, which makes more sense. I sometimes worry as a blanket, because I think that sometimes what's happening is climate change becomes the umbrella under which we're also tucking pollution, habitat loss of biodiversity due to extraction, not just changes to climate. And I worry that the public starts thinking that the only issue is because people associate climate with weather. So they're thinking weather or they're thinking temperature. Meanwhile, we're extractively cutting down rainforests and stripping seas. And I worry that sometimes that's not being almost like people are just thinking, oh, it's the gas in my car. It's like, well, it's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Because we might as well have a vacuum in the ocean, like pulling fisheries out, and that seems like, I worry that that's a bigger driver because lots of these species have been, it's amazing. I've been spending a lot of time recently looking at maps of the Earth during the last glacial maximum. This is fascinating to me. I was recently in Hawaii and you're thinking how did people find this kind of place? And then you start to look at what it looked like during the last glacial maximum. You're like, oh man, this is kind of traversable land. It's not hard to find a lot of places. You look at that Bering Land Bridge wasn't a bridge. Right. It's like a continent. So a lot of these species have been with us through tremendous changes in climate. So I don't worry so much how are yes, they'll shift and move and there'll be losses and all of that, but I worry more about the lack of biodiversity that we're creating through extraction. So do you think that that's possible, that the public is like almost not realizing the precarious nature of the situation we're in because they're just thinking about temperatures?
We'll get right back to the show in a moment, but first, I've got some good news about the WildFed TV show. You can now stream both seasons 1 and 2 on demand at myoutdoortv.com. That's myoutdoortv.com. My Outdoor TV is Outdoor Channel's premium online subscription service. They host thousands of episodes of hunting and fishing content, making this a great subscription service for anyone interested in the outdoors. But if you just want to see WildFed, grab yourself a free trial subscription and then check out all 20 episodes at no charge at all. If you decide to keep it, it's just $9.99 a month. We're currently in production for season 3 of WildFed, which should start airing around the beginning of 2023. Hey, thanks again for all your incredible support. If you haven't already, I can't wait for you to see the show.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, well, I could get into a whole long discussion about how, and I don't know other nations how they do this, but here in the US, we don't do a very good job of educating students who ultimately become adults on the scientific method and the nature of science and how to make, good decisions based on scientific evidence. So there's that whole big piece, which is a whole other probably conversation.
Can you pick that apart a little bit? I'd like to understand your thinking there and what you mean.
Yeah. So, all right. Oh gosh, I was just reading. It was an interview with Anthony Fauci, which has nothing to do with marine biology, but he's getting ready to retire at the end of this month. And he talked about his career and how during COVID times he was accused of flip-flopping. Like, oh, you should wear your mask. Oh, no, you don't need to wear your mask. Oh, you should have this vaccine. Oh, the incubation period.
And he did. In fairness, he did start with masks are not effective was his first position that he took.
Yeah, and
he was like, I kind of was fibbing about that.
Yeah, and I think maybe the mask thing truly was a fiasco, but he was accused of flip-flopping. And the thing is, if somebody was well-versed in the nature of science, you understand that you make your recommendations. I mean, if you're being an ethical and objective scientist, you make your recommendations on the best available knowledge that you have. And then you get more knowledge and you might realize, well, what I said is no longer supported by the evidence. So this is what I say now. And if people understood that the self-correcting nature of science, I think people would be maybe a little bit less polarized and would be able to make better informed decisions. And we don't do a good job, I think, of training from first grade on, what is the process of science and how is science always changing and improving? And the kids, they can understand, oh, we know that the world isn't flat anymore. And you could do something on that large scale. And, oh, we know that the earth is not the center of the universe anymore. Well, we had to collect data to make those changes in our thoughts. So I feel like even with some of the things with climate change, people, like you said, at one point we were worried about global cooling, and then we were worried about global warming. And we were worried about global warming because we were seeing these increases in temperature. We weren't necessarily seeing how increases in temperature can cause melting that then cause changes in the salinity of the ocean that then cause changes in currents that will then cause additional changes in climate. Right. And so it sounds like, oh, they say climate scientists, they don't know what they're talking about. It's like, no, they do.
Yeah. Well, you could take that perspective. I can see how somebody gets to that kind of jaded perspective, like these people don't know what they change their minds every week. But I will say that as I've come to because as a layperson who was not trained in sciences very well, I'm like the victim of what you were talking about in the sense that my training wasn't, effective. As I've learned more about science, it's caused me to become very skeptical. Not jaded, just skeptical
Yeah.
of new information or policy because of, all right, there was a time where the cutting edge science was the lobotomy.
Right.
And they went around the country promoting the lobotomy, and they were driving a spike into people's frontal lobe and scrambling their brains and being like, look, it works. And for
Yeah.
a while, people were like, it works. And there was it was a health craze driven by medical science.
Right.
And then we go, oh, we're damaging people. So that's made me want to step back and pause when there's new discoveries, because I feel like there's sometimes we jump to conclusions. Something that I've noticed lately, is I talk to a lot of folks who are like ecological historians. And
Mhm.
recently there was a discovery of some footprints out in white sands that would push back the date of humans in North America. They would essentially double it. And I've noticed a lot of the ecological historians are really, really skeptical. And they're like,
Yeah.
hey, I don't want to integrate this into my worldview yet. I want to see more data.
Yep.
And I, I think there's this other component of it. Since we're talking about this, it's not like scientists are robots. If they were, it might almost be easier. But the challenge is somebody gets really invested in their work, and then some new
Right.
discovery completely overturns, and they've got books and they've got speaking gigs and they've got an ego built around an self-identity about this false information that they've been promulgating their whole career, but not knowing they were. And it's, as you've no doubt seen, it can be really hard it's not easy for somebody to just go, oh, okay, I get it. The last 20 years of my life have been actually wasted on a rabbit trail that turned out to be nothing. I've been barking up the wrong tree or whatever. So people will cling to it, and then they'll try sometimes to, they'll resist and try to defame the new information or the person pushing the new information. So how do you sort through all that? Because it's not like, it's not as clean as we want it to be.
Oh, no.
It's messy.
It's very messy. And I mean, I'm skeptical too. And that's what I wish we did a better job of teaching. It's like, okay, anytime someone gives you some new information, you don't accept it at face value. You need to think about it. And I think that's, many of us will hear something and say, well, so-and-so said it, especially you can find it on the internet. My cousin just had we had this conversation about energy over Thanksgiving. He heard a
Sounds
professor.
Dangerous.
Exactly. He
Thanksgiving.
heard
It's
a
like, uh-oh.
professor talk about energy, and I'll leave it at that. But it was a professor, so he says he has to be right, and it's like, ugh, no. Did what he say make sense? And I wasn't going to get in an argument with him, because they'll tell you the last thing that you want to do if someone is really holding tight to something is to give them data and logic, because they're just going to hold
Right.
on tighter to
We're in the realm of the
their
emotion, not of the of
exactly.
logic and reason. Right?
Yeah. Now, as far as, and there are people who have staked their whole reputations on a theory, right? And or hypothesis that maybe becomes a theory, and they're famous for it, and it would be very hard to give it up. And I agree with that. There's a book, everybody talks about it. I forget when it was written, but it was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Kuhn, and everyone now talks about Kuhnian revolutions, and it's in science. And so people will hold one theory for a long, long time, and then people will start to find evidence that kind of picks away at it, and that's when you get the most resistance. And the new information is coming in, and people are very skeptical of the new information because it goes counter to what they've believed for so long. The whole idea of, continents move. It took a long time to get people to accept the idea of continental drift. Finally, they accepted the idea of continental drift, but the mechanisms, they didn't accept the mechanisms for a very long time, until we actually had so many pieces of technology that allowed us to go out and measure how continents drift and how the plates move, that in the face of all that evidence, eventually people had to say, oh, okay, yep, you're right.
Yeah, we
You're
concede.
Right.
Don't burn them at the stake.
Yeah, exactly. But
Wow.
I'm not a famous scientist, so it's easy for me. It's like, oops, I was wrong. No one knows what I said the first time, so it doesn't matter that, oops, I've been found wrong.
I'm just fascinated by the idea of what are we clinging to today that's wrong? Because it's a lot, and we don't
Yeah,
know, and we have no way to know yet, and so we operate running like false, or running incorrect programs,
yeah,
and it's scary to think about how far the reach of those ideas is into other fields,
right.
until you get corrected. So anyway, I find all that really interesting, but I don't mean for us to spend too much time there, but it's just fascinating to think about, because like I said, the lobotomy is like just such a great example to me.
Oh,
Like it
that's
makes me
a
want to
fantastic example.
want to wait and to see what
Yeah.
what happens before I jump in line for certain things. But
Yeah, and especially something, something where you're actually talking with someone's brain. I mean, that's the whole reason people get second opinions, or they should,
mhm.
when somebody suggests, "Oh, you know what? We're gonna just amputate your leg because we can't fix this infection." It's like, well, I want a second opinion on that.
Yeah. At the same time, you think of all those people who were the essentially test subjects,
Yeah,
and you can't help but be a little grateful because we needed those people to learn to do it right.
yeah,
So, like all
yeah,
the people who got bad surgeries, for instance, have led to the incredible fine resolution detail of the neurosurgeries we can do today. So it's like, thanks
yeah,
for that.
yeah. Well,
Anyway,
yeah,
what were
yeah.
you gonna
That
say?
There's so many rabbit holes we could go down.
Yeah, there are. Back to fishes, though. I would love to get your perspective on, since we're really big picture, maybe we can start to like zoom in a little bit here in a
Yeah,
moment. But since we're at such a kind of a big picture overview right now, I would love to get your sense of our situation globally as a species. We're 8 billion now. I think I was talking to your husband when he
yep,
mentioned we're 8 billion, and I went to
yep.
the
We
the,
just
the
crossed
counter. I
over.
was like, oh, we are. I got to start saying 8 instead of 7 now. So we're 8 billion. I don't remember the number, but a percentage, but a huge amount of our food is coming out of the oceans. It's essentially really like the last major wild food that we're eating at a population level, and
Yeah.
then population's growing. Everything I read says fisheries are shrinking. Where are we at? Not necessarily like, hey, can we keep doing this, or what do you think is going to happen? But like, where are we at? Like, if you were going to brief us, like I just arrived here from another planet, it's like, hey, how's things going on Earth?
Yeah.
What as a marine biologist, how bad is it? Are we being too are we catastrophizing, and is it not really that bad, or are we underselling how bad it is, or how do you view this whole thing?
Oh, boy, that's a good question, and I'm so bad with numbers too, because I talk about this in my non-majors oceanography course when we get to fisheries, and I want to say, and yeah, I can't fact check, but um, at one point I think they said that 90% of marine fish species were exploited. Slash overexploited. And I'm not saying 90% of them are overexploited, but of the fish in the ocean that we know about, 90% of them are harvested, right?
Mm.
So
Oh, okay, there is some fishery for them.
yeah, yeah.
Wow.
Uh,
So not exploited in the way, like I think sometimes lay people hear the term exploited, it's got a real negative connotation.
yeah,
You mean
yeah.
it exploited as in being used as a
Captured to
resource.
eat. Yeah,
Yeah.
used as a resource. So um, now it could be simply that you're talking about a small village somewhere in the Indo-Pacific, and that capture, it's not horribly selective. If somebody goes out and they fish for whatever they can bring home, and that's what dinner is, and that's kind of the way it was intended to be. Um, but then you'll have someone that goes out and fishes so hard that the species doesn't have a chance to recover. One of the things I'm really concerned about is everybody wants to head down to the Southern Ocean, and they're already doing this, and fish for krill. And the krill that they're going to fish for down there, when I was a kid, I think of krill as these little tiny things, but the krill, I mean, they sort of like little tiny shrimp. Some of them are fairly big.
When you say big, centimeter?
Yeah, centimeter. Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, you could see them. And
Hmm.
if you dumped your net down, you'd look at them and say, "Oh, okay, that's not what I thought. I can see those without a microscope." Um, but there's incredibly numerous, and they're a great source of protein, so let's just go catch them. But that whole Southern Ocean ecosystem, is really, it's an extreme environment, right? It's super cold. There's not a lot of primary productivity all year round. There are animals that live there, that only live there, that depend on the krill. That's not at the very base of the food chain, that would be the phytoplankton, but certainly the krill are down low. So you have all of these fish and fish species, all of these whales that rely on that. So if we go down and we harvest all of it out, not knowing, well, what is the maximum allowable catch that still leaves enough for everybody else, which I don't know if we have those numbers, uh, that's going to be a big problem. I I agree that we people need to eat, and you got 8 billion people, and you got to figure out a way to feed them, but I'm not sure that meat protein is the best answer for that.
When you talk about that too, it reminds me, I wish I could remember the person's name. There's a guy we interviewed in Maine who works in the lobster fishery. His first name's Bob. Anyway, he had talked about what he called eating down the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of scary to me when it's like, now that we're getting into krill, it's like, we started eating mastodons, let's say, and we start working our way down to now we're picking apart the algae and the plankton and we're starting to it's like we're running out of things to eat. And then you look at 8 billion people, you're like, okay, they're not made out of magical thoughts. They're made out of food.
Right.
So
right.
we're, and they and the more you feed them, the more people you get. So that's a little scary when we start eating the foundations of the ecosystem, given that that's not the kind of omnivore we are. So it's kind of indicative of us, and I think something your husband brought up was he was saying it's not like an easy answer to shift over to to farming fish, and
Right.
because we feed those farmed fish wild fish.
Yep.
Right. So
and all of the habitat degradation that goes into and this, it's worse for shrimp than it is for fish, but you got to grow them somewhere, and so there's all that's associated with it too.
Sure. And I imagine it's kind of like if you have a city, I think of New York City, let's say it's like a monocrop of humans. You have a very small percentage of other organisms there, of course. You have some cats and you have some dogs and you have the trees in the city and such, but it's mostly people. I mean, you go into a monocrop cornfield, you'll find a little bit of probably, some chickweed and things like that, but it's going to be mostly corn.
Yep.
And the problem is all of that excrement and all of that pollution and all of that stuff that's got to run out of those dense populations goes out into the surrounding ecosystem. So that's got to be a huge problem. I can't imagine how you really work around that. So here we are in this situation, but something you and I spoke about when we were in person together is you were talking a lot about predator-prey relationships. And so it seems like fundamental to this issue is the human predator-prey relationship. What's our relationships like with these things that we're eating, and how are we doing it? Because it's like this massive industrial extraction, well, it's just not sustainable, which means it can't keep going on without collapse. So what do we, here we are in this really precarious moment. And then also it's funny because we have systematically reduced, if almost eliminated, not completely, but almost eliminated our predators.
Yeah.
Very effective at that, so it's like the thing that keeps populations in check, our predators. It's like if we're eating down the ecosystem until we're getting down to krill, our predators have also gotten smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And now they're like bacterial and virals, all that's really taken us out at this point. Right. But what are your thoughts on that? Like, looking at predator-prey relationships, I imagine for the most part, what you see as a biologist must be mostly, I hate to overuse the word sustainable, but balanced in some way. It's like, hey, this could go on for, millennia. Like this is no problem. Like the lion gazelle relationship's not out of harmony or whatever however you want to frame that. but this one we're in is, right? So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So when you were here, we were just doing predator prey relationships in my ecology class, and you do the lynx and the hare, and you do the wolf and the bison and things like that. Um, and we were talking in class, the only way that predator prey relationships are sustainable is if the prey have some sort of refuge where they're not going to get captured.
I've
And
never heard that before.
yeah, well,
Thank you for bringing that up.
there was a guy. He was doing this out in California, and he was looking at these two mite species, and he did a whole lab experiment on it. Two mite species. One was the prey, and it fed on oranges, and the other one was a predator that fed on the mites. And if he put them in together, eventually the prey would eat all of the predator, or sorry, the predators would eat all the prey, and then the whole thing would collapse. And he found that if he spaced them out a little bit more, it would last a little bit longer. But the only way he could keep both the predator and the prey going for the duration of the experiment is he created these refuges, which were these little oranges that the prey would feed on, but the predators couldn't get to them. And so in that case, their refuge was safety. But for a lot of prey, so like if you were to do the lynx and the hare, when the hare populations have been driven down so low that the lynx can't really find them, it's a waste of their energy to keep looking for them. They need to switch to something else. Some won't, and they'll starve. But others might switch to small rodents or whatever else might be available. And so just by being rare, the lynx have the hares have found a refuge. Well, for us as humans, nothing really has been able to find a refuge. People will stop fishing for something if it's not commercially viable. So, people don't go out and hammer the populations of cod and haddock in the Gulf of Maine that much anymore because it's not sustainable. So, in that regard, we're not capturing them, but there is no refuge on Earth, really, or very few refuges left for the things that we feed on because of, like you said, habitat loss, pollution, climate change. So the temperature is changing either higher or lower. So if our prey, which could be another animal or it could be something like corn or grass or whatever, if they can't find a refuge, we can drive them to extinction, at least locally, and then that's the end of our food chain.
Would it be fair to say that we've, at the same time, since it's so easy to talk about humans as if we just arrived from some other planet, we're not like enmeshed into the ecology, right? So, and understandably, because we've in some ways really elevated ourselves up out of it, but obviously not really. So would it be fair to say that we've turned the world into a refuge for ourselves as well as a prey? I mean, clearly we can be a prey species. I mean, crocodiles will take people and tigers will take people. And certainly going back, it looks like, short-faced bears were pretty good at taking people, and saber-toothed cats and even avian predators. So now not only is there no refuge for our prey, but then we have total refuge so that our numbers keep growing and growing and growing without any check on that.
I think that's fair to say. I don't think even without refuge, we would be eaten to extinction.
Right. Of course not.
Because we're so good at reproducing our own population and finding ways to make sure we have enough food and shelter so that at least we can have one or two offspring to survive to the next generation. So I think we've managed to. I think, and this is where. As an ecologist, I look at this from two different viewpoints. I look at it as, humans, we're awful, we're bad. Look at all the terrible things that we've done. But then if you look at it, we're just a species. And what is the role of a species? It's to persist. It's to reproduce and have more of your own offspring. And we're just incredibly good at it.
Yeah.
And evolution has gifted us, well, I don't want to say that evolution is not directed, but evolution, the result of our human evolution has been the ability at this point to keep, I guess, outpacing all of the things that would act against us.
Mm-hmm.
but now we're coming up against it, right? There's 8 million people on the planet. In the Western societies now, the birth rate has actually declined
Dramatically.
below the 2.1 that you need to persist.
Yeah.
So parts of the world are experiencing, population decline. So it's a fun exercise in my ecology class. Well, have we finally hit carrying capacity for humans? I don't know.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, my mom was one of 9.
Wow.
I was one of 3. I have no kids, and I'm
Yeah.
44. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's almost because some people have been trying to almost raise the alarm about that a little bit. Like, hey, wait,
Yeah.
are we overcorrecting? Not everywhere, obviously, like you said.
Yeah.
Like, there's places where populations are rapidly expanding, but in some places they're rapidly dropping, and some of that is through choice and lifestyle changes. And hey, I don't have a farm anymore where I need to birth a labor force, but some of it has to do with xenoestrogen pollution and sperm rates coming down.
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's not
Yep.
all good. But I wanted to
Yeah.
go back to something you said too, because about that side sort of polar nature of humans, where it's like we're so good and we're so bad. I grew up with this kid, at least in my teenage years. He was this guy. He was like a mesomorphic body. He had like a genetically perfect body. I mean, his cardio was incredible. His muscular endurance was incredible. He was so smart. He was scary smart. He could
Yep.
do anything. He could learn anything. And he became a cat burglar. It was so freaky. He started robbing places, and
Wow.
he would get more and more bold until he ended up with spending he spent his life in prison. Um, it's like that to me. It's like when you watch somebody waste potential, it's like, it was so painful. It was like, man, he could have gone on. There was 100 fields he could have gone into and been at the top of.
Yeah.
He had all that potential, and like, it was like wasted on this terrible choices and this awful destructive lifestyle that didn't just hurt him, but hurt all these other people. I kind of see us like that. It's like we have
Yeah.
so much potential. Sometimes I think, like, I wish we didn't use this term human race. It's like, is this a race?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
maybe we should make it more like dialectic and less of like a competition. This seems terrible. But yeah, this whole thing is really interesting to me. And when you brought up refuges, it makes me wonder, because right now when I look at marine refuges that we've created, I mean, they must, what percentage of the ocean is actually refuge at this point? Must be very little, even though it's like
Yeah.
very important. We're doing the right thing. It's kind of like the beginning of the national park system. It's like, hey, this is a
Right.
good direction, but currently these refuges are not enough to continue to repopulate the seas, right? So are we
Right.
going in the right direction with that? It must be too slow.
Yeah. Gosh, I saw a number somewhere, and I want to say 5% was what was set aside, but that
Well,
seems
that's
like a
not
really
bad.
high number.
That's actually pretty good. That seems like way more than
Yeah.
I would have thought.
But I'm not sure that that number's right. And it was E.O. Wilson with several co-authors, or I can't remember, was basically saying we need to set aside 30% of
Mm-hmm.
the world
Yeah,
with
that
no
sounds
human
about right.
intervention. That's never going to happen. I think, yeah, we're certainly not doing enough. Um, I think setting aside areas, whether it's in the ocean or it's on land, can do some, in that it provides the habitat for the biodiversity that you want to conserve. And if you can conserve biodiversity in these small areas, you can use that as a source population that will leave those areas and go out and populate areas where they can be exploited. And you've probably heard of this before, because people talk about these source and sink um, design for, I'm going to say marine protected areas because I know more about that than terrestrial. But if you can set aside a reasonably good area where you have extensive biodiversity and all of the species that need to be in that ecosystem are there, and they're reproducing and they're growing, and some of them leave, and they leave that area and they colonize areas that aren't protected. And so that's a way to make sure that you have the species pool to go out and colonize those other areas. Um, it becomes tricky when you think about, okay, well, how do we design them? How big do they need to be? Should we have, they all need to be connected somehow so that species can move. There was a whole
Yeah.
series of research in island biogeography at one point that looked into that. Uh, but so that will protect habitat and that can protect species. But if you're looking at something like climate change, you can't fence off a marine protected area and say, okay, keep the temperature here at
Yeah.
this temperature, and you got to keep the pH at this pH, and you can't let any pollutants get into it. So that's there's only so much that those can do.
Yeah, and hopefully those are, you look, for instance, at the, like, let's say the Native American reservation system here in the United States. It isn't like we said, hey, we're going to set aside the places that you found most productive for your lifeway.
Right.
We were like,
Yeah.
hey, we're taking those, but you can have these badlands over here,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
that are not arable and that have, low productivity, and then they become essentially unlivable for your lifestyle.
Right.
So it's like they need to be the kind of places, in addition to what you said about climate, they need to be the right places where these animals can really thrive too, right? Because it
Yeah.
seems like industry is always lobbying to get the best stuff.
Well, I worked
Understandable.
as an environmental consultant for a couple of years after my master's degree, and one of the things that I was tasked with was to look at developments, look at what their impact was going to be, and say, "Oh, well, I have to go out and flag this wetland, and there's this big wetland in this property that you want to develop." And at that time, I think it's changed a little bit, but at the time was it'd say, "Okay, well, I have a 10-hectare wetland here. Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build another one right next to this, and that way, there's no net loss." It's like, whoa, you can't build something that's as good as what was already there.
Yeah.
So it's just like you're
We
saying with
understand so
preservation.
little of the interactions. I mean,
Yeah, yeah, and people, there's so much, go back to the nature of science, stuff that we didn't know. I mean, we used to think, I don't know, let's go way back, that nothing lived on the bottom of the ocean because it's too dark and it's too cold and there's too much pressure, so nothing lives there. And it's like, oh, that makes sense. But then you look at, well, technology has changed. And so now we can sample and we can go look and we can dive there. And, you got James Cameron with his submarine. Technology has allowed us to learn more, and it will continue to allow us to learn more. So they used to think, oh, a wetland is just where the ground is wet and plants grow there, and they didn't look at cycling of nutrients in the
mhm.
water and the migration patterns of birds and insects, and the ability of the existing plants to take up heavy metals that the new species of plants that you put in couldn't do. So the more we learn, the better we get at some things, but the more we also realize that, oh, a wetland is a functioning unit that you can't just rebuild.
Right. Yeah. Wow. Well said. And it always reminds me of the sort of I don't know what era that was. If it was Dark Ages or was it Victorian age? It must have been Dark Ages. But anyway, when the Catholic Church would sell indulgences to wealthy people so that they could
Yeah,
sin, but then they could pay. They could just pay a little bit and get an indulgence. It seems to me that that's a very similar system to, like, you can destroy this habitat, but you can carbon offset it somewhere else.
right.
I feel
Yeah,
like that's a huge mistake in thinking. I mean, maybe it's better, maybe it's less bad than the way we were doing it, but it's hard to call it better. I have a friend who says, he goes, like, if you're trying to get to Canada but you're driving towards Mexico, slowing down is not going to get you to Canada. No matter how slow you go, you actually have to turn around. And so sometimes less bad, just slowing down, doesn't get you going in the direction of good.
yeah.
So
Well, that's good. I got to remember that.
yeah, I worry about that component. And another thing, and I know you saw this in my lecture over there at the academy, was I get really concerned about what happens as we try to change how we're living on the planet. I get worried about the crushing of the human spirit in the process. Like, I'm worried that we end up, you know, hooked up to the internet through a neural link, eating 3D printed food in a pod.
Yeah,
And then it's like, well, we have to because of the environment. We have to because of the climate. And it's like, that's it, that's equally tragic to me. Maybe not equally, but it's pretty horrifying, dystopian anyway.
mhm.
Um, any thoughts on that? Because it seems like that's the direct, like, when we try to centrally plan, like there's been some major central planning catastrophes in the last century, right? Like that have happened. Russia had some of it, China had some of it, where we're like, let's try to centrally plan how a society works. Because
Mm,
because it's like, hey, once we have that like you were talking before, you mentioned the word geoengineering.
mm.
So this is delicate territory because we don't fully understand the system. So if we can start to play with weather and we can start to try to shift things, like we might make some huge fundamental errors too. And no doubt we'll make some mistakes even if we do it well.
Yeah.
Um, when we try to centrally plan, of course, we're managers. It's like what we love to do is like get in and try to like manage things. And I'm worried that as we try to manage our own lifestyle on the planet, it will become so horrifying and catastrophic that and then in the wake of that, for instance, like maybe you've been hearing some of this. Like one thing I keep reading about is how in an effort to curb climate change, much of Europe right now is shutting down coal plants, shutting down nuclear plants, and then they were shifting over to Russian sourced natural gas, let's say. But then now they're getting cut off from that, and what's happening is like Germans are cutting their forests down to get wood
Yeah.
to burn.
Yeah.
Now it's like, hey, wow, that's a worse outcome than you just using the nuclear plant
Right.
because now you're deforesting and that's going to be dirtier to the climate and you'll lose biodiversity. So you lose the forest and you put out carbon at a high
Yeah.
rate, So I worry sometimes it's like, you try to build up a utopia and then the dystopia ends up having a worse catastrophic cascade than what you started with. So any thoughts on that? Because at the same time, I look at this like back and forth. It's like, well, if we don't centrally plan things, we'll just keep doing what we're doing. And
Right.
that's pretty
Right.
bad. But if we centrally plan things could turn out really bad too. I'm like, I feel like we're between this rock and hard place. And I know that you don't have the answers to this, but I'm just curious how you think about it.
Well, I think one piece of the cure is people need to understand what we're talking about. So people need to understand science. Um, I I can't not think about that. When I think about how do we find our way out of this, and it's an interesting question because there's the nature of humans and anything else is we're all an individual entity, right? And so we definitely want to frequently do what's best for ourselves and then think about, okay, I want to do what's best for myself and best for everybody else too, but I'm going to put myself first. um, so that makes any sort of central solution difficult if people don't understand why they're being asked to do something.
Yeah.
And far as are we moving into that bleak picture that you say, and I don't know. I mean, if you and I were having this conversation 250 years ago, uh, how would we feel about our environment then? Because we'd
Hmm.
probably be concerned about getting enough to eat, and we'd be concerned about diseases, and
Yeah.
we'd
Typhus
be
and
concerned.
cholera and
So
polio.
yeah, it's hard. You can look back and say, things were so much better then. But so I'm 62 years old, and if I think about, and part of it is just I'm older, I've lived longer, I've seen more. But when I think about even how I felt 10 years ago compared to now in terms of
Mm.
my general level of unease about where we're going, I feel like there's more. I don't want to use the word anxiety because I'm not really an anxious person, but I feel like I've got so many more balls in the air
Hmm.
than I did, and I'm going to drop one of them. And I feel like
I think I dropped like 4 today on my way here.
yeah, as a species, as humans, we're getting to that point where, um, yeah, some of the things that we're inventing aren't, they're not good for us. I mean, and
Hey,
like you
can you
talked
guys
about,
make
like,
sure to keep your eye on these spent fuel rods for the next 3 million years? All right,
yeah,
thanks, because I'm
yeah,
dying, so we're leaving you
yeah.
these.
But like you say, what we eat now, and you know, the internet and cell phones, and I mean, I don't know how much, although I do believe that all this internet and cell phone is affecting our physiology and through our mental health. But What is it doing to our society? Yeah, I mean, but that's the nature of human beings, is to
Hmm.
continue to create and innovate. So
It's kind of an exciting time to be alive in a way, because I get really nostalgic. Like, wow, I wish I could have been here in the late Pleistocene. I think about that time a lot. That seems so amazing to me. The idea that just like 4,000 years ago, some islands
yeah,
still had, mammoths on it. It's like, oh my
right,
gosh, that's so close. I feel like I just missed it,
yeah,
Or
yeah,
yeah, there's all these different times through history. But then you think about this time and it's like, what a cool opportunity, for you, for instance, to be a marine biologist in the sciences at a time that will be looked back on as one of the most pivotal moments in Earth's history
yeah,
because
yeah,
of this like incredible. And I imagine as you and I sort of leave the Earth, and in these coming generations, we're at the beginning of it, but it seems like there's going to be an all hands on deck. It's just
yeah,
kind of starting now, I guess, in the last
yeah.
generation, like an all hands on deck. Like, hey, we got to really turn the ship around quick.
I
So it's
I
kind of
have
exciting.
I have faith in technological innovation. I mean, you can look, even if you look at something like solar, right? Even when I was in the 70s, my neighbors put solar panels on their roof and people thought they were insane, right? And they spent all this money on it. And you look at, oh, hey, it's affordable now. And one
Yeah.
of my friends, I mean, she gets enough solar, she sells it back. She has no electric bill.
Hmm.
So, we did it, and we did it in 30 or 40 years. Um, I think I wish we could do it tomorrow. I worry that some of this is going to come too late, and they also, I mean, what are the unseen consequences that we're going to have? Uh, I was reading an article back in I don't know, mid 1800s. Everybody burned with wood, at least in the US. They burned with wood, and they all loved the roaring fire. And it was very American, sit in front of your fireplace, which is a horrible way to heat your house. And so the coal, we started to discover, oh, coal is good and we should burn coal. But they had to build the stoves, and people say, oh, these stoves are un-American and they're ugly and we can't watch and whatever. And so people didn't want to use coal stoves, but eventually, everybody got a stove in their house, right? So even that technology was hard to embrace at first. So maybe, the wind and the solar and the offshore, those will become more popular, and hopefully they'll maybe, with hindsight this time, looking back at some of the things that we did, maybe we can, because we have the technology to study the environment better than we used to, we can maybe envision more of the negative consequences and mitigate against them than we could in the past.
Yeah.
So I want to be optimistic.
It kind of, in closing, and thank you for that. And because you're so right. I mean, one of the ones I find fascinating is the transition from whale oil and the
Yeah.
panic around like, oh my God, we're running out of oil. I
Yeah.
remember it was Anthony Robbins, the motivational speaker. I remember one time hearing him he read a newspaper story out loud, but didn't tell you it was referring to whale oil. And it sounded like it was peak petroleum oil scare.
Wow.
We're running out of oil. How are we going to light the streets? How are we? I mean, it was just this like crazy
Mm.
fear that happened when people realized like because petroleum hadn't hit yet fully, and the whale oil was getting scarce,
Yeah.
and you just don't see what's on the horizon sometimes in a positive sense. And so you're right; it's like really easy to focus
Well,
on the
the whole
scare.
reason they went to the coal burning stoves is because the cities had no wood anymore.
Hmm. Right.
And so it got so expensive to get your wood for your wood stove, because if you lived in Philadelphia, where's your wood
So
gonna come
true. When I look at old maps and images rendered of towns that I've lived in over the years, it's
from? Mhm.
amazing how many more trees there are now than there were in these. I'll see pictures of my town and I'll be like, oh my goodness, they'd cut. It was just denuded. Or you're in the forest in New England, you're constantly running into all of these rock walls. You're like, oh, there was no
Yeah,
forest here. This has
yeah.
all been cut. So
Well,
it's fascinating.
there's a photograph, I think it's in the library, doesn't matter, at the University of Maine, and it was the initial building, and it's out in the middle of a field. And you go to the University of Maine now, and yeah, it doesn't look anything like that.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. In closing, I wanted to ask about. It's so easy today too. Another like trope that's really common is like the kids these days, they're
Yeah.
so out of touch. They're going to inherit the world. What are we going to do? I'm curious about the positive attributes of the generation of kids you're training in these sciences today, because it's so easy to focus on, well, look at them with their devices and look at how they're doing this and that and all these other things. But I bet they embody some qualities that are really important to the future world too. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah. Gosh, that's the best thing about my job. My kids never get any older. They're 18 to 22, so that means I'm not getting any older either, right?
Nice.
Well, I feel they're anxious, but in some ways, I think that anxiety can be a positive thing, in that if you're anxious about something and you're not paralyzed by it, you are motivated to do something about it. And I think many of them realize what it is that makes them anxious. They understand in a very big way about climate change, and they're concerned about it. And they I don't know if they have the confidence yet to know that they're going to solve the problem, but I think they're, especially if they're a first year student, but by the time they're seniors, they're like, I can be part of the solution. So I think there's that. I also feel like even though they might struggle a little bit socially, I also feel like they have a lot more understanding of empathy and social justice and diversity and equity. And my students here, I mean, they've always been kind of polite, but they've become incredibly polite, and they thank you for things, and they tell you that they appreciate your efforts on their behalf.
That'll be a nice balance to the to our generations.
Yeah, right. And I really feel like they don't like where we are, and they want to change it. And I mean, that's probably true. I probably thought the same thing when I was their age, but I'll never count them out. I probably, who knows, when I was their age, what were they saying that I was doing that they hated? It must have been something else. Like, oh, they all wear alligator shirts. What's this crazy obsession with alligator shirts? I don't know.
They are going to inherit quite an interesting set of challenges. So I guess just on behalf of all of us, thanks for training them up in something that's so important. As taking care of our oceans. Hey, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I didn't know what direction we would go. I thought we would talk more about fish, but I couldn't help myself except look at the big picture with you. So any parting words, anywhere you want to point people towards, any work you want to give them links to or anything like that?
Oh boy, that's something that I probably should have done homework on. I would just say parting words to anybody who listens is to continue to be curious, to continue to seek logical answers, to be skeptical, like we were talking about, to not accept anything at face value, whether you want to believe it or not. Just continue to be an inquiring mind. That's what's going to get us out of all of this, is people continuing to be curious and looking for solutions.
Beautiful. And thank you so much for your time today.
Oh, you bet. It was fun.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a podcast guest or topic suggestion, or maybe a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host the WildFed TV show for? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 or 2 of the WildFed TV show, go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 20 episodes. Season 3 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2023. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed shirts, hoodies, hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.